figured we tackle a very light and easy topic for today, which is, does the universe have meaning? Which you do cover very fascinatingly in your new book, which is called Why. I see it behind you right now and in front of me, which I highly recommend if anyone wants to really dig into these topics. You are somebody who, let's describe you, a proponent of what I understand to be a philosophical position called panpsychism, which I understand is also an old idea that seems to be making a strong comeback at the moment. My question for you is, why now? What's going on in the world that is pushing this idea back to the surface?
It's a very good question to start with, and thank you for your kind words on my book. I guess maybe been the last 10 or 15 years, panpsychism in academic philosophy and even to some extent in neuroscience has becoming a more respectable issue that's published on and taught to undergraduates and so on. Still a minority view, but very much something that's on the table in a way. It was sort of laughed at insofar as it was thought of at all previously. So why is that? I mean, I think maybe if you take a slightly broader look on the history of our thought on consciousness, it's actually been a rapid change in recent decades. I mean, for a lot of the 20th century, people approached consciousness by kind of pretending it didn't exist. We had the behaviorist movement, who thought the only suitable subject matter for a science of mind was behavior, because it's behavior that you can observe and quantify and measure. And that dominated for a lot of the 20th century. Towards the end of the 20th century, in the 1990s, there's a change, and people start to see that consciousness is a serious scientific issue. The solving the so-called hard problem of consciousness came to be thought, that the taboo disappeared, came to be thought as a serious issue that we could do some serious science on. But I think for too long, people thought of it as just another scientific problem. And, we just need to do a bit more neuroscience and we'll crack it.
Right.
What I think people have seen more recently is that they've come to see the philosophical underpinnings of the problem. In my last book, Galileo's Error, I tried to trace the foundations of the problem back to their origins in the philosophical foundations of the scientific revolution, in the way Galileo, the father of modern science, designed the scientific paradigm we've been operating with for the last 400 years. So I think this is really something that's been baked into our philosophical assumptions for a very long time. And if we want to solve it, it's something we're going to have to really have a quite serious paradigm shift in order to do that. And panpsychism looks to be one promising way of doing that. That there are other more radical options people are considering.
More
but
radical.
I think
Okay.
that's really seeing the philosophical roots of the problem is perhaps and the failure, I suppose, of more traditional options as well.
So that, for me, that opens up like all these different avenues that I'd like to consider, and I'm going to try to like narrow it down. So I think your average person, when they first hear about panpsychism, or like consider like, oh, so everything has consciousness. I mean, it's a very beautiful idea on one level, but like exactly how far can we extend it? For instance, would we say that a styrofoam cup has consciousness, which seems not to? It seems completely inert. Well, let's start with that. Like in your understanding of what the term means, can my cup, can my computer, my phone, are these conscious entities, or not?
Actually, panpsychists don't necessarily think literally everything is conscious, despite the meaning of the word pan, everything, psyche, mind. That's what the word would suggest. But at least contemporary panpsychists, for them, the basic commitment is that the fundamental building blocks of the physical universe, perhaps fundamental particles like electrons and quarks have some incredibly rudimentary form of experience, and that the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from these more basic forms of consciousness at the level of fundamental physics. So that's the basic commitment, that, let's say, for the sake of simplicity, fundamental particles are conscious, but it doesn't follow that every random combination of particles itself has its own unified conscious experience. So panpsychists don't necessarily think this Batman cup I'm drinking from has consciousness, but they may very well think the smallest things it's made up of have some kind of very simple conscious experience.
And when you say conscious, do you mean an awareness of them, of itself, or just some sort of awareness that's hard for us to relate to, given our rather large amount of consciousness comparatively?
It's something more like the latter. Yes, often I find people use the word consciousness to mean something quite sophisticated, like awareness of your own existence. And that's something maybe rabbits don't have,
Right.
never mind fundamental particles. The way scientists and philosophers tend to use the word consciousness just means any kind of subjective experience. Your consciousness is just what it's like to be you. So, you're having a visual experience of the room around you, an auditory experience of my voice speaking to you, maybe the feel of the chair beneath your body. This is all part of what it's like to be you right now. Now, for a human, what it's like to be a human being is incredibly rich and complex, the result of millions of years of evolution. But consciousness comes in all shapes and sizes. What it's like to be a rabbit is significantly simpler. What it's like to be a snail, simpler still. And as we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of subjective experience. For the panpsychist, this continues right down to the basic building blocks of matter, which have, on this view, incredibly, almost unimaginably simple forms of experience to reflect their incredibly simple nature.
So let me read you a quote. It's about particles, and it says, in an essay entitled "Particles Do Not Exist" by physicist Paul Davies, we find that the particle concept is nebulous, and ideally it should be abandoned completely. John Gribben agrees and writes, "What we call those objects particles, for want of a better name, what they really are, we do not know. The particle concept is simply a crutch ordinary mortals can use to help them towards an understanding of mathematical laws." Okay, so given that, and we know there's all kinds of discussion in the science world, about the nature of particles and the nature of reality. But if we go with that and we say, no, we don't really know that there's these things called particles. Maybe they're excitations of various fields. The more we sort of reduce the concept, to me, and I'm not an expert in either philosophy or in science, but where it takes me is to more of a unified, what I'd call a whole or a oneness, which is a consciousness. But if particles don't exist and they don't make up objects, including living things, then how do those things get their consciousness?
That's an excellent question, Adam. And it's funny you should mention Paul Davies. I'm a huge fan of Paul Davies. He's such a free thinker and a very interesting
He's great
philosopher as well as a physicist. And actually, I just had an email from him today inviting me to a conference. He runs these very interesting interdisciplinary conferences, and I don't know whether I'll be able to get over to the US, but yeah. So, well, I when I talk about panpsychism, at least initially, I tend to talk about particles, and as I've just been talking to you. But I mean, actually, what I said was the fundamental building blocks of reality. Let's think of them as particles. But actually, you're quite right. Many theoretical physicists are not inclined to think our world is made up of little billiard ball particles, and are perhaps more inclined to think that the universe is made up of universe-wide fields, and particles are just local excitations in those fields. Now, so look, it's a question for physics, what the fundamental building blocks of the physical universe are. Whatever they are, the panpsychist view is that they are associated with basic forms of consciousness. So if you have the fields view and you combine that with panpsychism, then you get something maybe closer to what's called cosmopsychism.
Right.
Because if we think of the fundamental forms of consciousness of these universe-wide fields, and the fundamental bearer of those fields, if anything, is the universe itself, then we get the idea cosmopsychism, which is the form of panpsychism according to which the universe itself is a conscious entity and indeed the fundamental form of consciousness. And in fact, that's an idea I explored actually in my first book, which was very much aimed at an academic audience. I'm there, just come out in paperback actually. That's a more sort of challenging book, really aimed at a sort of graduate students in philosophy, consciousness and fundamental reality. But it's also something I explore in a more accessible way in my new book, Why.
And you're sympathetic towards it? Do you hold that it's a coherent view?
It's certainly coherent. I mean, I'm somewhat agnostic on which particular form of panpsychism, as we all should be in, these early days. I think it's really early days on consciousness. In some ways, we're not even at first base, so I think we should be open-minded. But it's attractive, as I say, because it perhaps fits with a field-based picture of reality that seems more appealing to many theoretical physicists. I've argued in a number of places it helps with the thinking about the philosophical challenges of panpsychism, but also what I'm addressing in this recent book is things like the fine-tuning of physics for life and how we can address that. And what I suggest in the book is that cosmopsychism, as well as being an attractive theory of consciousness, can perhaps help us understand how the universe might be fine-tuned for the existence of life. Because if well, actually, should I
go
talk
there
about that?
Well, I was going to ask you a question about it actually. We're on the same page, and I think we draw the same conclusions in some ways from fine-tuning. I think we agree that fine-tuning means some kind of meaning, some kind of purpose, some kind of setup, that the chances of the parameters being as specific as they are, either you have to appeal to a multiverse, and in your book you talk about the problems associated with that, and people are, I think, generally aware that it's attractive as a solution, but there are a lot of problems with it. Therefore, if this is the only universe and there still is fine-tuning of the constants of nature, there's a problem, so to speak, which is it seems as though the universe is programmed, so to speak, to produce life. The question then becomes, how is such a thing possible? And I agree with you that I think what it points us to is some kind of system, some kind of consciousness that brought it about. You're explicitly not empathetic to what you call an omni-God in the book. I'm not sure why it's omni as opposed to just God. I guess maybe because you can do a lowercase God and it just means like one of many. Is that right?
Yeah, I suppose just the omni characteristics, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence. I suppose, yes, to distinguish it from other conceptions of God.
Okay. So in your estimation, and maybe you could just explain for the audience, you agree that fine-tuning needs to be accounted for. What accounts for it if not for a creator of some sort?
Good. Yeah. So I think we're somewhat on the same page there. I do think just in our standard ways of thinking about evidence, the fine-tuning does point to some kind of goal directedness, some kind of directedness towards life in the very early universe. And I actually think we're kind of in denial about this for
Mm.
cultural reasons, because it doesn't fit with the picture of science we've got used to. It's
Yes.
like in the 16th century when people couldn't handle the evidence that we weren't in the center of the universe because it didn't fit. And these days, scientists laugh at them. Oh, those stupid religious people. Why didn't they just follow the evidence? But I think every generation absorbs a worldview they can't see beyond. And I think that's stopping us thinking clearly about fine tuning. I think in the West, we're often trained to be alert to religious biases,
Hmm.
bias you might have from a religious upbringing. But I think there can also be secular biases, bias that arises from a certain established view of what science is supposed to be like. And I think something like that is going on. I feel silly. It took me a long time to sort of have the courage in a way to sort of stand in front of my peers talking about cosmic purpose, and that's how these things work, don't they? Stops change when it's very, very hard to
In the world of
stand
philosophy, that's
up.
controversial.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think there's probably a sort of secular bias. I'd say in my philosophical tradition, and analytic philosophy, as it's called, probably most people are atheists. Well, there's a respected, healthy philosophy of religion minority, but mostly Christians.
Right.
um,
Right.
a few very good Jewish philosophers, one or two very good Muslim philosophers recently emerged, but I guess people coming out of traditional Abrahamic faiths. I suppose what I was doing that's in this book, sort of neither of those, So
Right.
it's like, so there isn't sort of an accepted category. It's not like I'm, gonna be, you know, kicked out of my university or anything. But I do feel a bit silly standing up saying, look, I think there's evidence for cosmic purpose. It feels a bit anyway. But yeah, so what can explain this if but I don't go for the traditional God either, because of the familiar problem of evil, the difficulties reconciling a loving God who can do anything with the terrible suffering we find in the world. So so this is the task in my new book, really, how to explain both the fine tuning and suffering. So I've
Yeah.
just picked like the atheist struggles with fine tuning, the theist struggles with suffering. Can we have a hypothesis that easily accommodates both? And I consider a range of hypotheses without settling on one for sure.
Hmm.
Broadly speaking, three hypotheses. So one is a sort of non-standard god or designer,
Yeah.
maybe a bad god, an amoral god, the simulation hypothesis that we're in a computer simulation, or actually my favorite non-standard designer hypothesis is a designer of limited abilities, maybe who's just made the best universe they can. So I
Hmm.
consider options like that, but it's not obvious to me. I'm a bit unsure about this, but it's not obvious you do need a conscious mind to underpin cosmic purpose. The philosopher Thomas Nagel has explored the
Yeah.
idea of teleological laws. So teleology, just from the Greek telos for purpose. So laws of nature with purposes built into them. So maybe it could just be a fundamental directedness of the universe towards life without any deeper explanation. So that's sort of the second hypothesis I consider, kind of taking it as a brute fact. And then the third option is what we've already discussed and connects most with my other work on panpsychism. The third hypothesis is cosmopsychism, the view that the universe is conscious and has its own goals. So, and I think this offers an attractive theory of consciousness, but also a very parsimonious theory of fine tuning. Why postulate a supernatural conscious being outside the universe
Hmm.
if you've already got a conscious universe and you can just think the universe sort of fine tuned itself? So that's my favorite hypothesis, although I take all of those options seriously and explore them.
You mentioned in the book Thomas Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos, which in 2012 was like this explosive controversy because he dared to question some of the orthodoxies, around materialism, and being an atheist himself, like you pointed out before, there was like this knee-jerk, reaction against it. Although I think he really broke the ice, at that time by making it sort of like acceptable to reconsider some of these ideas. He was relatively early, as he is for a lot of things. But so in describing your rejection of the omnigod concept, which is probably the best and oldest theological conundrum, the problem of evil, you have a phrase called the cosmic sin intuition, which I haven't heard before. I like. And you describe that as it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to deliberately create a universe like ours. And that has to sit heavily, I think, on people. You do point out also that the universe is confusing. At the same time, we've got acne and Mozart. We've got love and we've got brain surgery. There's this melange of great things and horrific things. And it's very confusing to be a human being and to live in this dimension. So your point is definitely well taken when you say like, hey, couldn't the omni-God have done a better job than this? So, but I wanted to ask if I have a few questions on this. You say it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to deliberately creating a universe like ours. Let's start with this. What does immoral mean? For a light question.
Right, big question goes to just briefly on Thomas Nagel, and then I will answer. I'm not being a politician dodging the question. It just what is interesting actually. Thomas Nagel, such a respected establishment philosopher, got absolutely hammered in reviews, very unfairly, very unfairly, saying he's lost the plot. And I think what's interesting, my book, 11 years later when it was published, has got a much warmer reception. Now, that's not because I'm a better philosopher. I'm a worse philosopher than Thomas Nagel, but I just think that shows a greater openness to these ideas, and we're seeing cultural change as it's happening. But anyway, yes, what does immoral mean? Well, I guess we quickly get into primitives here. There's morally wrong, something that should not be done. And I'm happy to be. I'm a moral objectivist. I think I talk about this a little bit in the first chapter of the book. Well, there's the books divide. My first book was aimed at my first book was an academic book. My second book was aimed at general audience. This book's trying to do both, so each chapter has a more accessible bit and then a.
Oh, it's very readable, by the way. It's very readable.
Thank you.
Really enjoyable to read.
Thank you. That's very kind. So in the digging deeper bit of the first chapter, I talk about moral objectivism. So I guess I'm a sort of Platonist about morality. Maybe I think there are, as Thomas Nagel was actually. I think in some sense, actually that's not quite right about Nagel. To take that back. So I think there are robust facts about good and bad that determine what ought to be done. I think we can make sense of them independently of the existence of God, I suppose. Why? What do you think?
I mean, I agree with you. I think that there's, I think let's put it like this: in the absence of an objective right and wrong, I don't know if that there is one, that there is any such thing as right and wrong, unless we have some standard to measure it by. It just becomes very subjective, and it's just one opinion versus another, and we see that playing out in the world all the time. One group of people hold this position and one holds this. I think it's wrong to kill all these people. You think it's not. And then we have a problem. So sometimes I think it feels like, although I'll credit you for you consider all these different options very openly, and I appreciate that, but sometimes I feel like it's like a failure of imagination to think about how we could have a purely good universe, but not in the way that we might have anticipated from our perspective. So can I give you two examples?
Oh.
Okay. Are you a great Game of Thrones fan?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I looked on
Watched it
YouTube.
all.
Okay, so Jon Snow, in discussing with the sorceress Melisandre, are talking about why her red god, would do seemingly these terrible things. She says he does some good things. He says he also does terrible things. And Jon says, what kind of god would do something like that? And she looks at him and says, the one we've got, meaning it's not that there's not a God. It's that either we don't understand what what it's doing, or in other words, sometimes it seems like a non sequitur to me, like, okay, there's evil, therefore there's no God. And you do say this, actually, you say maybe there's an evil God, or maybe there's an amoral God. But why people leap automatically from there's evil, therefore no God, especially if you consider the fine tuning and other factors that contribute to our understanding of reality. Why wouldn't it be just simply a better thing to say, well, the universe points to some kind of creative consciousness. I can't necessarily put my finger exactly what it is, but it does these things. And sometimes I like those things and sometimes I don't like those things.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And there are no certainties in this. I'm certainly not saying there's definitely no God. And one possibility is that we've just got morality wrong in some way. We're confused about morality, and I argue on Twitter a lot. And
I love your Twitter account, by the way. I'm a follower.
Thank you. I sometimes theists sometimes say to me, "Oh, who are you to decide what morality should constrain God?" And I suppose my answer to that is, yeah, look, if God exists and God is perfectly good, then of course, who am I to say? God must have some reason for doing what God does. And we get the beautiful Book of Job, the beautiful, well, who are we to understand what happens at the creation of the universe and so on.
Right.
I don't know if I'm quoting that correctly now, but
no, yeah,
something like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
But we're in an uncertain situation when we're trying to work out if God does exist.
Yeah.
And all we can do is start with our own understanding of morality. Where else are we going to start? That's all we have. And so, I talk a lot about this position, which is very popular and very interesting, skeptical theism, which says that, nobody's ever come up with a good reason why God does what God does, but we shouldn't expect to know God's reasons,
Yeah.
And but I guess my response to that is, look, you just got to do the best you can, and I think our best understanding of morality, which is what we've got to work with, does support, in my view, something like the cosmic sin intuition. It's not a certainty,
Yeah.
but it does seem, as best we
It
can make
resonates with
sense
you.
of things, as best we can make sense of things morally, it would not be morally right to create a universe like this if you could do something better. And therefore, our best understanding of morality leads on to thinking God doesn't exist. Now, of course, no, I agree with you. There's strong reasons pushing. I mean, I first got into this when I was teaching religion, actually, and I was found myself just, I'm so impressed by arguments on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
But then I realized actually that these aren't contradicting, right? The fine tuning argument, I don't think is not specifically evidence for God or the omni-God. It's evidence for some kind of purpose or goal directedness, and
Yes.
you can make sense of that, I hope, in the ways I've pointed to, without getting into the difficulties of suffering that you get with the traditional God. So I guess I don't see the motivation to try and make sense of God if there are these other ways of making sense of cosmic purpose. I suppose that's where I'm coming from.
I understand that. And like it seems like much of philosophical debate like seems to come down on what resonates with you, like whether this particular argument finds favor in your eyes or not, for whatever experience and reasons and life you've lived. But can I give you one last quick
Absolutely.
So I know you're a father, and you have young kids.
Yeah, 7 and 3.
7 and 3. So you're in the throes of like, those years of diapers and wake up in the middle of the night, and and those things make you so close to them, and like it doesn't go away, of course. It just morphs over time. My kids are older. When my oldest son was 1, he started vomiting for like no reason, like all the time, like full stomach, terrible. We end up, one doctor, another doctor, we end up at like Columbia Presbyterian with the world's greatest gastroenterologist. And he says we have to do an upper endoscopy. And he was only 1.5 at the time. And I won't go into the whole process of how terrible it is to get him ready for that. They can't eat, they can't drink for hours and hours. It's like, so he's going, baba, baba. We're like, and we're like, so we had to wheel him into the room where they're doing the procedure, lights blinking, and doctors with masks, and my wife. They say to my wife, and I hold him down, and so that was one of the worst moments I ever had. Oh, right, where they're putting the mask on him, and I remember thinking to myself, right at that moment, I said, "We're trying to help you." Even though he's in mortal terror, he must have felt betrayed by these people who have helped him for the last 18 months. And it was like this paradigm shift moment for me where I was just like, of course, like if there's this omni-God, right, and we're going through quote unquote suffering, maybe it could be that from our very limited perspective, it's the same thing, that the omni-God could be saying, I'm doing this for you, and I wish you could understand, but you won't be able to until you grow up, so to speak, until your consciousness expands to the point where you can absorb what's taking place, but none of it is actually bad. It just seems that way. So that's just something I think about when I confront the problem of evil, which I admit again is a very, very difficult problem, but I figured I'd mention it father to father and see if it resonated.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds close to this skeptical theist position, which I do think is perhaps the most attractive response. And I mean, it sort of takes the problem very seriously, doesn't try to give some, sort of human way of saying, oh, why, oh, it's really good, what's happening, or and there are some it's a very interesting discussion in contemporary philosophy I'm very interested in. There's a recent new book on skeptical theism. But I suppose, and it could be a possibility. I think if God does exist, then something like that has to be true, I think.
Right.
It seems to be more plausible than, I mean, another person I deal with in the book is Richard Swinburne, a very distinguished Christian philosopher who I debated recently on the because he reviewed the book for the Times Literary Supplement, and then we debated it on the Unbelievable channel, and he thinks he does know what God's reasons are, what God's reasons could be, and I find that, I mean, he's a brilliant philosopher and his solution's ingenious, but it's like, no, that's too simple. So I prefer the solution that, there's just something beyond human understanding here. But I suppose, again, I just think we need to, all we can ever do as human beings in our limited epistemological situation is work with the understanding we have. I mean, I give the analogy I give in the book, which I was quite proud of, actually, is to dark matter. What is it? 80% of the universe is this stuff we don't know about. And, it could be that if you fully understood the dark matter, it would change our theories, not just of dark matter, but of the matter we do know about. because
Totally.
maybe once you knew about dark matter, there'd be some more unified theory that incorporates both, that's radically different from any of the theories we have now, right? But nobody says, oh well, okay, we can't do science, right? Because we don't know about 80% of the universe. We work with what we have and we do the best we can. So likewise, it could be that, God's morality is so much higher than mine, and from God's perspective, you know, it's all different, and I just have no grasp of that any more than worms can do mathematics. But we have quite good understanding of mathematics. Oh, sorry, no.
Right.
We have quite good understanding of morality, and we just have to work with that the best we can. And I think working with that the best we can casts doubt on the idea that there's an all-powerful loving being behind the universe. But it's all very fallible and uncertain.
Fair enough. I have time. I have 4 minutes and one question remaining. Towards the end of the book, you advocate meditation and art as ways of sort of exploring like the deep recesses of consciousness, I suppose, and you also mention psychedelics. Are you a proponent of all of these things? Do you recommend that people explore them? And what is your feeling about what they can do for people?
Well, psychedelics are obviously big risks, so I wouldn't recommend just, going out and willfully doing psychedelics. It can be incredibly scary. On the other hand, I think it doesn't make sense that these things are illegal. They are not physically addictive or don't seem to be physically harmful. They can be dangerous psychologically, but we let people do very dangerous sports, for example, with into human
Football, sure.
freedom
Yeah.
allows for that. Yeah, or, the crazy. I mean, climbing. So many people die from free climbing. And I think under control, there's been much recent research on psychedelics. Great book by my friend Chris Leatherby on this research into psychedelics, and the mental health benefits are extraordinary. So I think there are real benefits from I think decriminalization and careful, supported use of psychedelics. I think, we know for centuries, if not millennia, they have been used as a spiritual tool. So I think there is a place for psychedelics. I mean, so I put forward a sort of, this is the more exploratory final chapter, but I have this theory of spiritual advancement, which is something about breaking through our conditioned ways of seeing reality, the way we project onto reality our culturally specific history and ways of seeing the world. And it seems as though that's the way the world really is. But when you have great art, I talk about the Beatles as a fellow Liverpudlian, when you have great art, when you have meditation, when you carefully attend your experience in a very radical way, when you take psychedelics, but all of these things can help us break through in more or less subtle ways our conditioned ways of seeing the world, and get through to what there seems to be, for people who go far with this, something beneath it, something William James called the more. There seems to be some kind of greater reality.
Where he called it the more, M-O-R-E.
Yeah, the more. I kind of like that expression.
Me too.
To sort of be sort of neutral on how we're thinking of this. Of course, some would call it God, but for people who've seriously meditated or had mystical experiences or broken through in some way, there does seem to be some kind of higher reality beneath it all. And I think we can all, in subtle ways, through creativity, through simple living, kind of try to open ourselves up a little bit more to the more, however we understand that.
I love that. Thank you so much for this conversation, which was so fun and enlightening. And the last thing I just wanted to say is that I really like the way you bring philosophy to with like a fun, lighthearted, young vibe with it. I think you're doing a lot for the world of philosophy. And as I said, I recommend people follow you on Twitter, and buy your books and check out what you have to say. And it's very exciting what you're doing, and I wish you a lot of continued success.
Oh, thank you very much, Adam. Yeah, I've really enjoyed these last 4 or 5 years, sort of reaching out beyond academia. And I'm glad you said younger. When I Google, for some reason, says I'm 60. I can't work out why that is or how to change it, but I'm significantly younger than
Well,
60.
you look good. You look good.
But yeah, thank you very much. This has been a really stimulating conversation.
My pleasure. I hope to talk to you again. And have a great day.